Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a really complex and honestly quite fascinating alternative geopolitical broadcast from the Promethean Updates channel, featuring commentators Barbara Boyd and Susan Kokinda. Now, right off the bat, I want to be totally clear with you. The claims we're going to unpack touch on some incredibly charged political, medical, and global events. Our goal here isn't to take sides or endorse these views, but just to impartially map them out so you can really understand this emerging worldview. It's this massive, sweeping narrative that tries to connect completely scattered global events into one unified theory. And seeing how they construct these arguments, it's just absolutely fascinating. The whole broadcast really pivots around this explosive assertion from Susan Kokinda. She argues that a massive global realignment is happening right now, led by Donald Trump, and it's aiming to completely dismantle the political and economic strategies of the last century. We're not just talking about a tiny tweak in foreign policy here. They're describing a total, systemic rupture of the old globalist order that's been running the show since the World Wars. To them, the alliances that define the 20th century are literally being torn down right before our eyes, making way for a totally new paradigm. It's a huge claim. So let's break this down into 5 key pillars. 1. A shifting geopolitical landscape. 2. NATO and the E3. 3. The Biolab allegations. 4. Globalists and middle powers. And 5. The American system. All right, kicking things off with part 1, a shifting geopolitical landscape, focusing on the Iran memorandum. The presentation starts off by detailing this new 60-day memorandum of understanding signed with Iran. Now, what the hosts really hammer home here is who is actually brokering this thing. Normally, the U.S. moves in absolute lockstep with the G7. Nations like the UK, France, Germany, when dealing with Middle Eastern policy. But this broadcast claims this new agreement completely breaks from those traditional Western alliances. According to them, the U.S. worked directly with Russia and China to secure this deal, purposefully leaving the G7 out in the cold. They frame this intentional exclusion of traditional European allies as a massive diplomatic earthquake. It's kind of their first big proof of this new global configuration. And what's super interesting about how they frame this deal is that it's not seen as just some temporary band-aid. No, they see it as a permanent off-ramp from decades of Middle Eastern conflict. They outline that this agreement demands strict nuclear verification and aims to immediately reopen the Strait of Hormuz to stabilize global oil prices. In return, Iran gets a legitimate pathway right back into the global economy. According to the broadcast, this is a highly calculated move to finally pull the U.S. out of those forever wars. They argue that by neutralizing Iran as a proxy battleground, the U.S. is actively stripping power away from older imperial interests that basically thrive on constant overseas conflict. Moving on to part 2, NATO and the E3, and a major clash of military strategies. This brings us to what the hosts see as a deep structural fracture right inside NATO itself. They set up this stark contrast between European leaders and the new U.S. military command. On one side, you've got what they call the E3, the UK, France, and Germany. The claim here is that these nations are desperately pushing for deep strike capabilities to hit inside Russia, deliberately trying to keep the conflict in Ukraine going. But then on the flip side, they point to the newly appointed American NATO commander, General Andrews Greenwich. They quote him saying, rather shockingly, that Russia is actually not looking for conflict. Just think about the sheer irony they're pointing out here. America's traditional European allies are supposedly pushing for war, while the American military command is actively hitting the brakes and pushing for de-escalation. The hosts argue this exposes a massive rift that basically flips the whole Ukraine narrative on its head. Okay, let's jump into part 3, the Biolab allegations, untangling the Ukraine narrative. Now we're getting into a really sprawling narrative that connects Ukraine, biological research, and domestic U.S. politics. To keep our terminology straight, let's look at how the hosts define a couple of key programs. First, there's this initiative called the PREDICT Project, which was officially funded by USAID. But according to the broadcast, instead of just doing global pathogen surveillance, this program was actually used to fund dangerous gain-of-function research overseas. If you aren't familiar, gain-of-function basically means artificially souping up a virus in a lab to see what it could do to humans. The hosts explicitly link this specific project straight to the Wuhan lab in China, framing it as the foundational apparatus behind the very origins of COVID-19. Taking it a step further, the broadcast introduces a company called Metabiota. Now, originally, this company was supposed to just safely dispose of leftover Soviet biological materials. But the hosts claim Metabiota was actually used to harbor dangerous pathogens inside Ukrainian biolabs. And it gets deeper. They allege this company was heavily funded by the U.S. Defense Department and functioned as this lucrative investment vehicle for Hunter Biden and his associates through their involvement with the Burisma board. So the broadcast is basically asserting that American political and defense entities were deeply financially entangled with these hazardous overseas labs. This timeline right here perfectly illustrates the massive thread the hosts are pulling across an entire decade. Let's just walk through it step by step. They start in 2014 claiming Western intelligence staged a coup in Ukraine, which effectively opened the door for Hunter Biden's alleged investments in Metabiota's Biolab research. Then, boom, we jump to 2020. Notice how they draw a straight line from those biological research networks directly to the COVID-19 pandemic, which they argue totally upended the U.S. election. Finally, we arrive at 2025 and the sweeping presidential pardon of Hunter Biden. The hosts put a huge emphasis on the fact that this pardon stretches all the way back to 2014. According to their narrative, this isn't some random coincidence. They believe it's a highly calculated shield designed to cover up those specific Ukraine biolab activities from a decade ago.
All right, on to part 4. Globalists and middle powers, and the economic rupture.
Shifting away from the biolabs, the explainer moves into the economic battleground, which the hosts really view as the ultimate theater for all this global change. The broadcast uses quotes from folks like Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, to argue that the old guard is openly admitting their system is collapsing. In the broadcast, Carney is quoted saying that the rules-based order is breaking down. Now, that rules-based order, that refers to the economic and political architecture the West built after World War II to govern global trade and alliances. But here's the kicker. The Promethean hosts don't see this breakdown as a tragedy. They see it as a massive victory. They argue that figures like Carney are scrambling to form new alliances simply because the United States is basically saying, yeah, we're not playing by those old globalist rules anymore. To really grasp this clash, look at how the hosts map out these opposing forces. It's like two totally distinct camps. On one side, you have the new guard, the US, Russia, and China. According to the broadcast, they are actively tearing down the old order, using tariffs and striking bilateral peace deals. Opposing them are the middle powers, nations like Canada, France, and the UK. If you look at their goals, the ideological clash is just night and day. The hosts argue these middle powers are desperately clinging to each other to preserve the old system, focusing on things like climate change initiatives and keeping the funding flowing to Ukraine. But the overarching point they're making here is that these middle powers are fundamentally weak. They just don't have the real geopolitical muscle to keep the old order alive without the U.S. backing them up. Finally, we reach Part 5, the American system, a new philosophy of political economy. This brings us to the absolute ideological root of their entire worldview. According to the hosts, the antidote to this whole globalist system isn't communism and it isn't socialism. It's a return to a specific historical framework they call the American system. This model completely rejects the modern finance capitalism championed by those massive Wall Street investment firms. Instead, it prioritizes tangible, physical, and moral advancement over just stacking up digital wealth. Think about that contrast for a second. It's a direct rejection of making money from money in favor of physical production, actually building things. It relies heavily on tariffs to protect domestic manufacturing, making sure that a nation rewards real physical productivity over financial gambling. The hosts argue that this system completely changes how a nation even measures its own success. Instead of obsessing over a rising GDP or checking the stock market every 5 minutes, a society governed by the American system asks totally different questions. They measure true progress by asking, are we producing more physical goods? Are the people genuinely more productive in their daily lives? And perhaps the most unique one, are the citizens more culturally and morally uplifted? It is a really profound shift from relying on cold, hard financial metrics to actually measuring human and physical potential. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a really vital question. Regardless of where you stand on these massive claims about Ukraine, NATO, or the global economy, what actually happens when completely different frameworks for reality collide on the world stage? As these detailed alternative narratives continue to gain traction and spread, how will they reshape the future of global power and our very understanding of diplomacy? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for exploring this with me today. Keep asking questions and keep learning.